Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We live in a fascinating time, a time when really a small number of multinational companies have more money and power than some governments, profoundly influencing our societies. And we're here today to discuss whether governments can partner with corporations to the benefit of their citizens, and whether these behemoth corporations are ready, willing, and able to assume the social responsibility that is really commensurate, with this enormous power that they increasingly wield. So really, we're going to be examining today, how should the private sector or the public sector relationship look? How should it evolve as we move into the future? Now, I am obviously going to be taking questions from you here in the room, and I see some very good friends with us, so welcome, Robin. And but we're also going to be using our technology, Slido. So if you're familiar with Slido, you can obviously access it via the GlobeSec app. And if you're not familiar with it, you can open your web browser. Go to slido.com, enter the event code GlobeSec, or hashtag GlobeSec 2018, and choose the room Maria Teresia. Now, if you would, please join me in welcoming my wonderful panel. Please come on out. So our fabulous panel that we have, first I'd like to start with Greg Lebedev in the center. He's chairman of the Center for International Private Enterprise, or CIPE. Then Scott Carpenter, immediately to my left. He's managing director of Jigsaw. If you're not familiar with Jigsaw, it is owned by Google's parent company, Alphabet. And it is a technology incubator focused on tackling geopolitical problems. And finally, last but not least, is Katerina Kakilikova, and she is MasterCard's Director of Public Policy for Central and Eastern Europe. So thank you all for joining us today. Greg, I'd like to go to you first. CIPE works every day with governments around the world, since your mission is to strengthen democracy through private enterprise and market-oriented reform. Do you see a new symbiotic relationship between governments and corporations that didn't exist before? Are companies becoming new partners in the leadership of our societies?
I'm not sure I would say it's a new symbiotic relationship. I would argue that we need to have a symbiotic relationship. I think the relationship between government and business has to change. It has to move from, at least the American experience, where there's an adversarial relationship. It has to become collaborative. And it has to become collaborative for the reasons that effectively this meeting has been talking about for the last several days. Global social problems are now too big to solve alone. And the instability, the violence that we see, that we talk about, that we worry about, from our point of view, from the work that CIPE does all around the world, that's a global illness that's rooted in a lot of economic conditions. And the World Bank tells us that there's something like, 200 million people who are unemployed right now, just literally probably sitting around. The ILO says there's another 1.4 billion people who are in what they call vulnerable occupations. It's the informal society, it's family businesses, but the imprecision of the numbers really doesn't matter. There are hundreds of millions of people who are relatively idle, and this is an unhealthy condition. These folks are ripe for disillusionment, and they are ripe to do worse. And so what we need, I think, and apropos why your question is so good, what we need is some medicine. We need medicine to avoid a pandemic of discontent. And the solution, by the way, is not more make work government jobs. We can talk about the merit of that or the demerit of that at another time. What we need is the real solution is the private sector, the business community, because the business community is the only engine in any society that creates real jobs, pays real taxes, invents real stuff, delivers real products and services. Now, I love the private sector. I recognize its value. I am a champion of it beyond belief. There's also a but that I'm going to add, and the but is that notion of harnessing those things to solve these global social problems and social anxieties, that only works if government and the private sector work together in partnership. And the partnership, by the way, has to be horizontal. There really has to be some parity there. The old days in which government can dictate to business and say, no, the business should do a little more of this and a little more, that's behind us. The only thing that really works these days is that symbiotic partnership, if we can get it, because very frankly, government no longer has all the answers. Now, government regularly thinks, and rightly so, what is its job? Its first job and its only job, they would say, we regulate stuff. We make rules. And that's exactly right. They do. And by the way, we need rules. But they also have a second job. And the second job is to enable, to encourage, to support, to do a variety of things that create an environment that allow the business community, wherever it might be, to do the things the business community needs to do to produce those outcomes that we're really talking about. If business can be successful over and over again because the climate is right, that's the medicine. That's the antidote to this epidemic of discontent that will wash over all of our shores. One more but. Government has a tendency to over-regulate. Well, that's what they know what to do. You know, when you get bored in an afternoon, you can write a regulation. You can do something. And it has an impact. And frankly, since government doesn't really understand how business works, it has the so-called unintended consequences. They'll write a regulation, they don't really know quite what it impacts. But they can do that. If government over-regulates and misregulates, they can suffocate every good idea in this room. So the thing that we all have to remember, you can't hobble a horse if you want it to run faster and faster.
Excellent
and
point.
This is particularly important if your only form of transportation is a horse.
Scott, I'd love to go to you next. Governments on a daily basis grapple with a number of pressing geopolitical issues, obviously including violent extremism. When it comes to online, we're talking about toxic, trolls spreading propaganda, harassing journalists. Talk to us about what Jigsaw is doing, how it has leapt into the fray, basically building tools to make the world safer by addressing the unintended consequences of digital communication.
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to thank GlobeSec for this opportunity to come here and to address some of these issues with you. And thank you very much, Kathleen, for the question. I want to just start by telling you a little bit about why Jigsaw was created in the first place, right? We had this access revolution that has quickly led us to a point where we have almost ubiquity in terms of access. So just 360 million people online in 2000. We now have about 7.2 billion smartphones out there. So what is amazing to me is how far this digital revolution has come and how fast it has arrived. But that access revolution then led to a content revolution, where, as you know, something like 40 hours of video are uploaded to our YouTube servers every 1 minute. With that has come a lot of challenges, of course. And so why did Google create Jigsaw in the first place? It was because we looked out and saw that there were going to be these complications, these challenges that we were going to have to address together with partners. It wasn't going to be all of our responsibility, but that we had to be engaged with people who understood the problems in the social sciences, who understood the problems from a government point of view, but didn't have the technical knowledge or understanding to see what was possible. And so with the issues that you've just mentioned, things from like violent extremism, harassment online, countering censorship online, all these challenges that we as a society are confronting, we all have to do our part. So Jigsaw was created to address some of those challenges.
Can you give us some success stories? Tell us about some of the things you've been able to accomplish.
Yeah, one of the first areas we started with was violent extremism, and at a time when no one was really comfortable about talking about it. It was back in 2009, 2010, and then there was this idea that the internet, when we first started talking about violent extremism in the internet, back then people were saying, it's not a problem. This is not going to be a problem. Why are we talking about this? Today, when you talk to people about violent extremism, it's as if the internet is causing it. So there's been this huge transition in thinking about it, both both sets of thinking are wrong, by the way. But we've been looking at this for a very long period of time. So one of the methodologies that we developed over time was something called the redirect method. And what we wanted to take advantage of and leverage is what advertisers around the world take advantage of and leverage, which is the ability to advertise very concretely to what people's expressed desires are when they enter a search term. They advertise against it. And so what we did was we went out and we talked to a lot of former violent extremists. I traveled to Iraq and met with a lot of former ISIS fighters who had defected to better understand their relationship with their phone, their relationship with the internet, how it developed, how it changed, understood what they were looking for. And one of the insights that came from those discussions was that when I asked them after they had defected, if they knew when they left all the things that they knew right now, would they have still gone to Syria? And they said, yes. I said, but if you knew 6 months beforehand, would you have gone everything you know now? And they said, no. So there was an opportunity, there was a bit of cognitive opening 6 months before, which wasn't there one day before, because at that point, they argued that they were so brainwashed that there was no other choice that they would make at that point. And so what we've done is we've, talking to experts, working with external partners, began to think through how advertising and curated playlists of YouTube videos could be created that when people put in search terms like, I'm really interested in Anwar al-Awlaki, that maybe they were interested in more than just Anwar al-Awlaki and what he had to say. If they were putting in, how do I get to Syria cheaply?
Dead giveaway.
Maybe there was something else that they were looking for, and there would be an occasion to redirect them to content that might give them a different perspective. We found that in a pilot that we ran for 8 weeks, that this pilot was extremely successful in getting people to engage with the content. And we have since published that methodology, and many organizations around the world, in the United States, in France, Bangladesh, the UK, others are using the redirect method to help inform people who are looking for this information to perhaps take a different tact. And the great thing about this is that hopefully, and I know this to be true, there aren't that many people who are out there doing this, thank God. But if there are people that we can help move in a direction where they choose an alternative course using tools that every day makes Google a lot of money and makes the people who advertise with us a lot of money, why not try it?
So this is you doing your social responsibility.
I think it's doing our social responsibility, but it's also, it's driven by this idea that if we don't find ways to address this in creative, technical ways, then governments do have this idea that they'll just tell us to take things down off the internet, remove it. And we do a lot of that today.
So you're being proactive.
We're trying to be proactive. We're trying to be proactive.
Katerina, I want to go to you. We didn't mean to leave you out. Let's talk about what MasterCard is doing. I know you're one of the world's largest credit card companies, the second largest one in the US. You have something really fascinating that I personally wasn't aware of before this panel, and that's the Center for Inclusive Growth. Talk to us about what it is, why MasterCard started it, and what it's doing.
Well, yes, we have actually many initiatives, among which, of course, also the Center for Inclusive Growth. Well, the need for the center has been on our minds for quite so many years, and it has actually formally been created in 2013. The idea was basically to put the question or the discussion of or the topic of the financial inclusion back on the agenda, on the higher priorities on the agenda for the policymakers, because we do see that with 1 million people or over 1 billion people living in extreme poverty, or 2.5 billion people not being really financially included in the system, we see the potential of these societies to unlock the great basically to unlock some economic growth by including these people also in the financial world as we know that, and allowing them access to basic financial services that we all in this room already know and use every day. So this has been obviously the primary objective to basically even for MasterCard to bring new clients in, just to be to
So
be quite open
altruistic,
about
but
our
still
interest.
self-interested.
But
Okay.
Obviously, I mean we are a private company, so I have to be honest about
Let me
that.
ask you, are these those that are excluded, this potential body of new customers, they're financially able to ultimately participate in a more formal economy? Where are they? Why are they outside the zone at the moment?
Well, there's several groups or different types, obviously, of financially included, or what we call financially excluded, or then also unbanked. I mean, there are several reasons. You have groups. I mean, if you look at Europe, for example, or the U.S., I mean, unbanked people have usually other reasons to be unbanked than just living in really extreme poverty. But then if we look in the emerging world, I mean, this is primarily the area where we're looking into, because we're looking also into communities that are kind of unrepresented or inactive economically in general. This is why also the focus of the Center for Inclusive Growth is actually the group of women and the youth, because this is where we see the greatest potential, and this is where we see the the greatest number of really excluded people. But obviously, it's not only them. I mean, we talk about financial inclusion in the UK. You might think, financial inclusion is probably not an issue or in the UK, but it is. I mean, we still have people who are unbanked in our understanding. I mean, in the European understanding or the developed world understanding, for several reasons. Some of them they don't want to. Some of them they can't. Some of them they just don't want to be included in the way we usually are, but they want to have some other means of payment or entering the world, especially with the growing digitalization. They kind of find themselves excluded just because, I don't know, they don't have a credit card because they didn't perform well in the risk analysis. So there's several reasons, but obviously the one of the major objectives of the Center for Inclusive Growth was to look into the regions where really the need is probably the greatest. So if you look at also the projects that, I mean, maybe I should have said at the beginning, there are two goals of the center. So one of them is actually to have, to bring the community, the academics, together with the governmental institutions, together with NGOs and companies, and to bring the knowledge and expertise and actually have an unbiased discussion or bring insights into the functioning of the economy, to talk about what we need to unlock the economic growth or the potential economic growth, to financially include the societies that are excluded, etc. So was to kind of create a platform to have this open, independent discussion, and in that way provide kind of a guidelines also for the policymakers what to do, what to do if you want to actually address this issue. So this is one thing, and the other part of the goal of the center is actually to obviously kind of even fulfill our philanthropic initiatives to kind of realize the projects that we wanted to realize. So some of the examples you can find in Myanmar or in Nigeria, where basically we cooperated with local either institutions, players, NGOs, you name it, to create programs either in microfinance or to find a way how to, for example, create access to management of to create access to economic resources for women, let's say in Nigeria. So there are many things that we are looking into. One project that has not yet been realized, and we've been thinking about it for about a year, is to cooperate with local NGO in Israel, for example, that is concentrating on the excluded minorities, such as Arab minority, to help them with microfinancing programs for women in the Bedouin society. So we're looking into projects like that, not necessarily in big numbers, but something that we think can open up the discussion, create interesting best practices that can be obviously reproduced later elsewhere.
Greg, I was wondering, when we're talking about these partnerships, do you think it really should be companies' role to help governments govern better, to make better policy, to create more innovation, competition, and economic growth? And if that's the case, then how do you create the atmosphere where that takes place, where governments are really ready to let business come to the table and have a real voice?
I think that, when you have forums like this, and now we're in the 21st century, we talk about things. Well, this is the 21st century, so there's going to be a whole new set of rules and
new ways of doing
and behaviors and directions and all of that. But for the 21st century, I think it is going to be an imperative that there be a collaboration between government and business. Very simply, as I said earlier, because problems you need a collaborative approach to solving problems. At a certain point, governments recognize the complexity of the societies they're trying to govern is such that it needs the assistance of essentially the very, very smart people that are represented by, these guys here and their companies, and that they are assets. They can bring ideas, and they can also help shape a policy framework that will allow them to do what they need to do. So what we at SIPE continually try to do is we create moments of dialogue. And you do it in a variety of different ways. It sounds simple to have in the conversation we're having today to say, oh, no, we get people together and they chat and then they come away and then we're all smarter. In different countries, you do it in different ways. But we believe in the institutionalization of a conversation. I know a while ago I was in Botswana, and we've worked with that government, and they understood the value of this so much. President would assemble his cabinet, and you'd have business leaders, and they would meet 4 times a year. They'd have an agenda, and the agenda was a mutual agenda. And by the way, business had a whole bunch of things they wanted, didn't get them all, but it put them on the table, and they could argue, they could debate, they could compromise. But what they ended up doing is they understood each other better. They did have a common understanding of problems that needed to be solved, and they were moving ahead.
How rare is that?
Excuse me?
How rare is that?
It's rare. It's hard because government thinks it's smarter than everybody else, and by the way, businesses don't trust government. See, if you get too close to government, they're gonna hurt you. They're gonna regulate you. They're gonna learn too much about you. And that's where, again, I think one of the things that SIPE does in its processes all around the world is we work to build trust between the two. The fact that government might be suspicious of business because they think that we move too fast and we have profit motives and all of that, and we think government is sluggish and they're not very smart and all of that. I think we can break down both those barriers, and in so doing, build a common trust, and by the way, solve some problems along at the end of the day.
Scott, I want to talk a little bit about some people who do have concerns about this discussion when we're saying, let's have more cooperation between Google and government, between Facebook and government. There are a lot of folks that makes very uncomfortable. They're worried about their privacy. They're worried about their data. You look at the world's 5 largest corporations by market capitalization, and that's Apple, Alphabet or Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and Facebook. And you have created these inescapable tech platforms that really govern much of the business world. They're virtually invincible to competition. They're not regulated by government. They don't really fall under the rules, that cover monopolies. So how do you address their concerns that maybe they aren't so comfortable with us talking about you partnering or handling the Department of Defense's cloud?
Wow.
As has been suggested, perhaps.
It's
being floated.
There's a lot in there, and I'll try to address some of it.
And keep it short.
Yeah, keep it short.
At least as short as the question.
Yeah. Look, I don't know how many in this room remember this guy whose name is, Ed Snowden.
That
right?
guy.
That guy. So those leaks really, really shattered the confidence that many of the tech companies had in our own government. And the betrayal of trust that we felt was because of the betrayal of trust from our users, right? So the people that our business exists because we have these micro relationships with individuals who trust us with that data in a way that they would not trust the FBI. So this I can completely understand when there are concerns from public interest groups and others about us working too closely with government. On the other hand, I also understand the frustration that government can feel when, because of those leaks, we have worked very, very hard to make sure that we are not going to be, we will not be able to be penetrated in that same way, where we are focused on things like end-to-end encryption and making sure that we are all providing our users as much security as they want. And that is frustrating to governments because they feel like they're blind now. They don't know what's going on, and that can be very dangerous in a society where we're worried, understandably, about things like terrorism. But it's always this balance, and part of why Jigsaw exists is so that we can at least engage in some of these conversations to better understand what the concerns of government are, so that we can again think through what is possible technically. You know, when you go to get your car fixed, there's some problem that you're having with your car. You don't go into the shop and say, I have a problem with the car and here's how I want you to fix it. Because you recognize you don't know the first thing about it, or you would have fixed it on your own. So sit down and let's talk. But one of the challenges that you mentioned, though, is that because of the concern that many of our users have about having those conversations too closely, is that you do want to create some space to be able to have some of these conversations, but in a way that doesn't affect our users, doesn't negatively impact our business, and where we can hopefully help government better understand what the nature of that business is. When that first happened, I was, a very close friend of mine was very senior in the Defense Department at the time, and he called me, and he was interested in how we might locate, like, the person who was doing leaking at the Pentagon. And I thought to myself, and I said to him, you guys have just tanked our business, and this is the first time I'm hearing from you 12 days later, and you're asking us to help you in this egregious thing that you've just done? So it's that type of thing that I think that can be profoundly worrisome. At the same time, I think there is a recognition that the U.S. tech companies, and I would take issue with the idea that there's not competition. There's a ton of competition. The number one competitor for Google search is what? Facebook, right? Where do people, if you're not inputting a search into Facebook, you're asking your friends, where should I go? Where should I go to dinner? I'm visiting this town. Where should I go? What am I doing? All of us have received those types of, we have competitors on all fronts. But there is a recognition that we're very good at what we do, and we've achieved scale. And therefore, there probably are ways that we can be helpful. And we are helpful to state governments, to cities, to others. I think where the trouble has come in is whenever there are discussions about how to help intelligence services, or how to help defense, the Defense Department. Some of you may have seen this letter that a number of Googlers signed related to a very small project with the Defense Department, helping using AI based on our ability to help you all identify your photos. Like if you have Google Photos and you just put in a search term, it'll pull up all the photos you have related to that person or to that location or whatever, and that's because of the work that we've done with AI. Well, the idea was use AI to help the Pentagon go through drone footage, which most of it is over desert or whatever, and to try to find faster ways to curate that information for anything that was useful. And that was very controversial in the company. So
it's interesting. It just sounds like as we go forward, there's going to have to be some trust built and repaired on both sides.
absolutely. And in my view, we still have a ways to go.
Katerina, let's talk about how vital financial corporations like yours are in helping, in particular, in developing countries, addressing complex challenges. You touched on one earlier, talking about ending financial exclusion, but also in particular, a big problem also in this region, shadow economies. How are you working on that?
Actively and intensely. Well, maybe I would actually just explain, because it has already been said here that actually governments do need to cooperate with the companies like MasterCard or others, because they do need the expertise, the data, the statistics, the information, because only then you can actually make really good decisions. And you as a politician are kind of judged on the quality of the decisions you make and on the consequences that these decisions have. So obviously there is a need also on the side of the government to engage with with companies, with the private sector. And this is one of the reasons why actually MasterCard is even active on such issues as shadow economy. Obviously there's also our economic interest in the end, but it's something that has to make sense to both sides. It's kind of a win-win discussion. So with regard to the shadow economy, or addressing the problem of shadow economy, which is indeed very relevant in this region, the goal is that to help the governments to address the problem with maybe sometimes solutions that already exist for a long time, and that tend to be sometimes even simpler than actually some of the regulatory initiatives or some of the other solutions that the governments might think of. In terms, or in case of shadow economy, I mean, it has been identified for this country, for this region, that several studies have been made, has been estimated between, I don't know, you look at, for some countries that perform rather well, from 11, 12% to up to 20%, 25% in the Western Balkans. So apparently an issue, especially in the times of economic problems, when the government are looking for new resources to basically make the ends meet. So
what are some of the
kind of
innovative
VAT
solutions?
gap, you basically do need to address this issue. How to do that? I mean, several initiatives obviously, but the governments are looking into some regulations that are more stringent, bringing in new solutions, starting online registration of transactions, etc., etc. Whereas actually one of the solutions at hand is, card payments or cashless payments, because these are payments that are trackable, and therefore basically you already know that these transactions are going to be taxed easily. So this is actually the story with which we went to the government, saying, you have a problem, we can help you, and it's easy. It's actually by bringing in or kind of expanding the solution that already exists everywhere, just to have some kind of maybe more coordinated approach. So we have worked with many governments in the region to either put in some measures or just actually kind of copy measures from some other countries where they already exist. So again, bringing the know-how and sometimes solutions.
So you're saying financial firms like yours are particularly well positioned for that?
Definitely.
I mean, MasterCard really should be applauded for this. I mean, we go around the world and we preach about the fact that the informal economies, the shadow economies, they're vast. governments seem to struggle not to know what to do with them, and even though you remind them, look, if you bring these people in some fashion, your GDP, you get a bump in GDP, you get people participating in the broader society in a healthier way, a more constructive way, all of those things that you guys have figured out how to do. And again, it did take the expertise and a conversation between you and some set of governments to say, this can really be helpful. I've got techniques, I've got experience, and we can do it. And by the way, nothing bad's going to happen. They're always worried about a negative consequence. So I think that what you've done there and what you've designed is something that frankly should be, shared as widely as, and you pick up a few extra customers and
yes,
along the way.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, just today we have had a discussion with the president of the financial administration of the Slovak Republic, where I mean, we are basically on the same ground. We all agree that more cashless economy is helping them to basically collect that money that they need. And then also even the story about shadow economy, we tried. There's a lot. It has a lot to do with education. Many people don't want to be really in the shadows. I mean, obviously there are groups or there are businesses that decide to do so for several reasons, but many people don't. And the reason why they are is just sometimes they just don't know. The citizens don't know what kind of consequences this has for the economy, for their own life actually at the end of the day. So it takes takes a lot of conversations, but I think it's really fruitful conversations that we're having with the governments, and not only in this region.
Greg, I think on this issue of these public-private partnerships, I think perspective really is everything. Talk to us about what you've learned at SIPE as you try to advance this around the world, about the difference in the point of view, say from one country to another, one region of the world to another, as they're looking at their level of trust in the government versus the private sector, and so how their point of view can be so very different on these.
I mean, obviously, this is the perfect audience to know that there are cultural differences that shape how everybody behaves in different environments. It is, as you say, it's a function of your own experience with both government and business. If in fact you have a society that's a hugely commercial and hugely successful society, there'll be a greater inclination to do partnerships because they wouldn't seem threatening. On the other hand, if you run risks with public-private partnerships in economies that are dominated by, say, crony capitalism. Why? Because it's not a real part. It's a fake part. It's a partnership, but of a kind that we don't want. It's a partnership between the government and people that they just happen to know and are particularly fond of. So you have to pick your environment that can obviously not only optimize what you're trying to accomplish, but you don't stumble into situations whereby you're compounding some domestic conditions that are unhealthy. But again, the beauty of a public-private partnership, especially in economic terms, not in the figurative terms that government and business should talk, is that the private sector is a source of a solution to a government problem, and they make money, and so they bring money and make money. So I mean, there really is there's a wonderful connection there if you can find the right environment to do it.
Scott, how do you think that comes into play with, say in the U.S., there's this perception, I guess, of more trust, greater trust in business, in people feeling more comfortable perhaps with Google and Facebook having their information than in Europe, where perhaps there's a greater trust of government. Do you think that comes into play with the way European governments have been cracking down on the big American tech firms? We were discussing this last night, and I mean, obviously, the European Parliament, in 2014, that passed a motion saying Google needs to be much more seriously regulated or heavily regulated. In 2017 was when the European Commission slapped that record antitrust fine on Google. So, I mean, is there a provincial bias at play in this?
Well, no. I mean, obviously, various political cultures evolve over time. And so I think that Google obviously started in the United States and has, in the United States, we have very strong free expression protections under our Constitution. We also have, I think Americans have a very different view of privacy typically than many Europeans do. I also think that the wave of social media, et cetera, hit Europe in some ways faster because it came all at once. So I think that there are a number of factors that have gone into the frustration that has yielded to some of the actions that you touch on. With the GDPR regulations and how Google has been working very, very hard to get ready for those, which I think is in a week.
Can you explain those in case the audience doesn't know what you're talking about?
Yes, sorry. The Commission passed a requirement that big tech companies make sure that all of their, to ensure the privacy of all of their users in very kind of strict and also in very ambiguous ways, but set a task for the companies to meet these requirements by a date certain, and that date is 1 week away. And it has taken a lot of effort, and there's still a lot of ambiguity. And I believe that we're going to be ready for that. But one of the things that, this is just a personal thought, is I realize how much work we're putting into this and how much engineering we're putting into this. There are very few companies in the world that could do this.
You can afford it, but everyone else may not be able to.
Maybe not. And so I wonder what that does down the road.
So it benefits you and hinders others.
Yeah, what if
perhaps?
it becomes a barrier to entry? So there are some unintended consequences of this, but I understand some of the challenges that governments are trying to address in response to what people are feeling or fearing. But I also think that my concern is we have to be able to continue to innovate and don't want to kill that ability in a way that would be ultimately harmful for Europe as a whole. And so those are some of the ideas that come to mind when you ask that question.
Can I just
Sure.
add, since I know very little about your business, it allows me to speak very freely about it. What you were just saying about the cultural differences between the United States and Europe with respect to privacy. I mean, going forward, the complexity of what they do and probably what you do is going to get, it has to be, is very nuanced because you're a global company and you're enjoyed globally, so you're used globally, yet you're regulated nationally. And these regulatory environments all have different expectations. I know I did a speech a couple of weeks ago on free speech. Europeans have a different view of free speech than we do. Different history. Not that we don't all agree with the notion that there should be freedom of expression, but it finds itself in a different way. They have already regulated hate speech. They have outlawed it. There are ambiguous definitions about that. So we have to be mindful, and these guys have to be particularly mindful, and I think you make a good point. The costs of mindfulness, if you will, are considerable as we're taking interesting, important, and global products and sharing them. There is a price to be paid as we move into different environments that have different expectations for what we can and can't do.
Katarina, before we go to questions, I want to ask you, I mean, do you think that perhaps we're reaching the point where national governments will be unable to really fulfill the hopes of their citizens for this future that we all want to live in if they don't create these alliances with these large corporations? If they, like the Googles and the Facebooks, if they, or the long-standing, corporations that have been around for years, like MasterCard. I mean, if it's sort of, if you can't beat them, join them.
I think so, because I mean, the challenges that already we're facing. I mean, with the globalization, with digitalization, with extremely fast innovation process, etc. I mean, I don't think governments in general have the capacity of doing it alone. It's just not there. I mean, you cannot even have the resources to be able to address this in timely manner without any kind of cooperation with the private sector. It's just, I mean, to my opinion, impossible. So yeah, definitely.
Okay. Well, let's go to questions. We have them right here, right in the front. So why don't we start right here? and then we'll go to this one over here. If
So-
you would introduce yourself, please.
Yes, my name is Rand Waltzman. I'm from the Rand Corporation. So this is for Mr. Carpenter, actually. So given that you're working very hard to create an impression that Google is a socially responsible company, I have to preface that my daughter works at Google, so I can say what I want.
Not for long.
Not for long. Not after this question. So given that, and plus the fact that I'm the very last person in the world to defend anybody in Congress over anything. So my question is...
This is going to be a doozy.
So my question is, given the recent Senate Intelligence Committee hearing, where Google, Twitter, and Facebook were all called on the carpet, the companies all chose to send their general counsel. So given the optics of that, together with your desire to establish yourselves as socially conscious, what was behind the thinking of that choice of sending your lawyer? That's my question.
Well, in our case, what's great is our general counsel is also our head of policy. So there's a nice nexus there. Seriously, Kent Walker is not just our general counsel, but he's also our head of global policy. And Jigsaw ourselves, we've had lots of briefings, opportunities to go up to the Hill and talk to people, not in hearing context, but to be able to again, have people ask questions, try to understand what we knew, when we knew it, how we knew it, et cetera. And so I think I'd like to maybe understand a little bit more about what the concern is there from your perspective.
Well, the concern is lawyers have a bad rap. And when you send your lawyer, it looks, I would say, to the general public like you're trying to hide something. It looks like you're lawyering up, you're hiding behind a lawyer. That's what it appears to be.
Well, I disagree, and I think that the testimony and the questions and the answers were pretty forthright. I would ask that people make up their own minds in reading that testimony and to understand whether we were forthcoming or not. I think we were.
Okay. Ayman? Ready?
Ayman Mhanna from Lebanon. I run a press freedom and media development organization. So let's travel south from Europe and the United States to countries with very weak institutions, weak judiciary, actually absolutely no law, not even regulations, no law that even mentioned the internet anywhere. And yet businesses are using the internet, are trying to innovate as well in all sectors, but in a totally unregulated environment. Not the unregulation that actually enables business and encourages innovation, just lack of understanding of what intellectual property rights are, weird definition of cyber crimes, weird definition of online defamation, and you have judges who at some point have to deal with issues that they are not aware of. So whether SIPE or Jigsaw, what is your role in building the capacity of the legislative body and the judiciary? I'm not talking here about talking with the government, the executive branch. Legislative and judiciary to build the capacity of those who write laws and those who have to decide who's right and who's wrong.
SIPE?
SIPE? Okay.
Thank you
Keep
very
coming.
much.
You catch.
I'll go back to the guy with who's complaining about lawyers. I think
All right. Greg? I think this is yours.
One, I would take issue slightly that that's all governments. Yeah, legislative, judicial, what have you. I think to solve some of the problems that you're suggesting could exist, Scott's already answered it in his conversation with this gentleman. These guys work hard at explaining and describing what they're doing. You're right. Legislators have to be educated about a wave of new stuff. We all do, by the way. So it is incumbent probably upon the businesses themselves at this juncture to proactively approach all elements of government that are going to have some conceivable oversight of what they do and teach them the business. And I think, you know, apropos of your comment about the bad optic of lawyers, the other day they had the hearing in which Mark Zuckerberg came to the Hill. And this is all very serious, and we had all our well-dressed legislators up there who, with the best of intentions, demonstrated they knew very little about his business. And he was a superb witness. He was not only well prepared, he knows his stuff. He invented that business. He did a whole lot of stuff. But it was an asymmetric conversation. It may have looked better, by the way, but in terms of information, it was a good demonstration of why all these businesses who do extremely sophisticated things that are themselves evolving, that we need to again have that conversation with all elements of government and say, understand us, understand what we do, understand how we can help, and you will then be better able to deal with us when you bump into us in some of these less regulated environments.
One of the thing I would add is that there are, working with universities and think tanks and others to develop kind of model legislation, to do those sorts of things. And Google and other companies do support those sorts of efforts. But ironically, it's not scalable for us to go out and educate everyone in these ways. But I think demonstrating where possible to point to good examples of legislation where countries are getting it. But as you know, it's very difficult even to get people to engage, even if you have those model rules and legislation. Can people understand it, what it is that is being talked about in those draft bills? Sorry.
Right, so let's go to a questioner right here. Lady wanted the mic right here. And I don't know if we'll have time to get to the others. We're running short.
Thank you. My name is Marilia Maciel, and I am from Diplo Foundation. A question to Scott, coming back to the dangers of collaboration that sometimes happen between governments and the private sector. You started, I think, to speak about Project Maven, but I think you didn't conclude actually what you were thinking, which is a collaboration between Google and the State Department to offer artificial intelligence developed by Google for military purposes. Do you think that this brings dangers to the company in the sense that all this intelligence has been developed through the data that users have provided to Google through their searches, through their information, and users did not sign up to that? So do you think that there's a danger that further down the road, this will taint the image of the company that you said has been not, sort of a trust has been broken since the Snowden revelations? And a short question to Gregory. You mentioned the dangers of over-regulation, and I completely agree with you. But you also talked about a symbiotic relationship between governments and companies. The problem is that by definition, a symbiotic relationship, if one dies, the other partner dies as well. So if there is a close relationship, then how governments can step back and introduce the regulation that they need to introduce in certain cases, such as data protection and competition and taxation, for example. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, you'll both have to keep it short.
Okay, I'll keep it very short. I don't know. I don't know. I think that there's a very big debate to take place within society and also within the company about what direction it wants to go. But I think that is a decision that the executives of the company should be allowed to make. And then we'll see what the reaction of our users is down the road. But in that particular instance, again, my own personal view is that it was not in any way designed to be part of any sort of lethal program. It is a tool that we all use on a daily basis to help us sift through the massive amounts of information that we have available to us as individuals to be able to find the needle in the haystack.
Greg?
I'm not suggesting by any means that collaboration means an eventual incestuous relationship between the two. That won't happen. I think the outcomes that we're always seeking are essentially a higher level of awareness of each other, if nothing else. I mean, Scott's right. I mean, companies don't have the capacity to make everybody smart about increasingly complicated things. But even as regulators, if we've sat down and we've had a good knockdown drag out about some problem or another that's common to both of us, we don't mind, businesses don't mind regulation. They want reasonable regulation. They want sensible regulation. And if a conversation, hopefully on a regular basis, will at least allow a regulator to say, yeah, I understand that better, and I was going to do this, but I think now all I have to do is this. That's all, those are the outcomes that we want. I mean, by the way, regulation is critically important to the successful functioning of these businesses, because everybody needs rules to keep, to ensure that the game is fairly played by everybody. So you want you want your legislator to be sort of the smartest man and woman in town, so he can create, or she can create, an environment that's going to allow these guys to do what they need to do.
Katerina, anything you wanted to chime in on?
I fully agree, definitely. I mean, we all want level playing field, so I mean, this is why, you know, the point of the discussions with the governments are just, is really cooperation. And I don't think we would face the world, at least definitely not in the EU, where the regulator would suddenly become our friend to that extent that no regulation would come our way. I just cannot really see that. So obviously, we don't like all the regulation that comes our way. There is tendency to over-regulate. And I think the Prime Minister of Slovakia said it very nicely in this morning, when he said that obviously we do need some regulation, but it should be flexible enough, and it should set kind of frameworks rather than over-regulate and push the businesses out of the business. So,
well, I am afraid that we are out of time. Thank you, all of you who raised your hands. I'm sorry we didn't get to you. And we did just have a couple of questions on Slido, but we've just had such a great conversation. I hope you would please thank our wonderful guests with me, Scott, Greg, Katerina, and we'll see you all at the dinner later this evening. Have a good evening.
Thank you.